Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions. On Wednesdays, we talk about things that affect you in your life, some of the economic issues and national issues that are taking place that may impact you in your business or in your life, some of the things that you may want to be aware of or think about as you're moving forward and looking forward to next year and the year beyond. My name is Mark Breckbill. I'm a CPA. Been in business with my own practice for about 25 years. As part of that, I do a lot of business work, business consulting. Prior to that time, I had been in private industry for a while, and then for a number of years was involved in banking and was chief financial officer of a couple large banks and chief operating officer of a bank, and did some things like that, which gave me an opportunity to see what goes on in the world of banking, finance, and economics. And then prior to that, worked for one of the big CPA firms auditing the publicly traded companies, and that was an interesting opportunity as well. Plus, during that phase, I was primarily focused on large banks, so had an opportunity to see what goes on there. So, it's like with anything. It's nice to be able to experience some things, and it's especially nice to be able to experience some things that allow you to help others. Even though during that period of time that I was experiencing those things, it wasn't always the most pleasant. So hopefully, I will give you some things to think about that'll save you from some of the unpleasantries that I had to deal with. And like I said, it is not a financial planning show. It's really more about the big picture, kind of what's going on nationally, internationally, kind of a lot of macroeconomics, some microeconomics, and things like that we're looking at. And so just generally some discussion of those topics, because a lot of people aren't familiar with some of those issues, may not be aware of what's happening. Also, because I am a CPA and I've done a deal in some of the other things like the PPP loans, which are the Paycheck Protection Program loans, and some of the economic impact disaster loans, the EIDLs. I could maybe share some information there that will be useful to you if you've got a business, or if you're involved with a business, or maybe you've got friends that are doing that and running those. So, It is a call-in show, so if you have something you want to add or ask, you feel free to call in 220-9788. That's 220-WSTU. Be happy to take your question or get you on the air. It's because as anybody that has dealt in the world of finance and economics knows, there is nobody who knows everything about everything, and much of what goes on is guesstimations, suppositions, and extrapolation. So, which sometimes can go awry. But as I've mentioned before on the show, one of the things that is true is that with the basic economic principles, they have been most of them have been scientifically tested. So pay attention to the science. Oh, anyway, they've been scientifically tested, and so they do produce a specific outcome. And no matter how many times you wish for the outcome to be different, it isn't. It is the same economic outcome. So a lot of it depends on what you put in as variables. But if you do the same thing the same way, you will get the same result. And that's the thing that people have a problem with in economics, is that sometimes they think that if they do something different, if they do something the same, they will get a different answer. And that hasn't worked. And last week, we were talking a little bit about that. And what I was getting at and wanted to follow up on this week was the whole concept of some of the Keynesian economics, which largely has to do with the fact that that its basic principle was that the government could borrow an unlimited amount of money. And so therefore, if government pushed that money out, to people and gave it to them, that they would end up with, not having an impact on anybody else, that the government could just continue to borrow money, print money, and provide money to people with no, with no consequence. And we had tried to do that a number of times and found that that doesn't work. And we have found consistently that it doesn't work. But like I said, we do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different answer. Now, people aren't stupid, so they say, well, if I just do this, or if I just tweak this, or if I just do this, I'm going to get the answer I want. So we've heard, for example, that, well, if the debt that's created is based on infrastructure, then that's not going to, that doesn't make a difference. That's an investment. So, and so it won't hurt anything. Well, that didn't work, and that doesn't work. It didn't work when we had some of our other big programs through the Bush administration, through the early Obama administration. Remember Shovel Ready? All in all, no matter what you do, it ends up with the same thing. We still have a tremendous amount of debt that we have not worked out of, and the problem is that at some point, it doesn't create enough economic growth to pay back that debt. Even simple things like, let's say a city borrows money for redevelopment, and they go in and they take, instead of taking a neighborhood and building within it, a neighborhood that already has infrastructure, they go out and create a new town, a new center, a new development, a new shopping area, whatever. And you've seen them do it. They'll come in, they'll take an area, they'll clean it up, they'll clean it out, and then they tear everything down, and they build all of these, they put in all these new street lights and roads and sewer systems and all of the drainage systems and plumbing and all of the utilities that need to run and everything else. And they create this great situation, with the idea being that we'll make up for that on taxes, because now that'll increase as these new businesses come in. Bring Burger King in, and McDonald's, and all of those places, and they'll pay taxes, and the economic activity will cover that, and it'll and so we'll come out ahead because it's an investment. But in reality, you're pretty much not going to come out ahead, and here's why. And is that when all of that work is done, you spend all that money. Let's say you spend $10 million to redevelop all of that. The taxes that are going to be paid, the increase in taxes you're going to gather, are going to cover, are going to come in, and definitely you'll get an increase in taxes because property values are up. But at the same time, those properties that you did, those investments you did, the underground, the streets, all of that, they will have to be maintained and replaced. Somewhere down the road, you're going to have to do a replacement process, and you're going to have to dig up those roads, and you're going to have to replace all that. Well, interestingly enough, about the time that you've recouped your initial investment, if you start from scratch, by the time you've recouped your initial investment, it's time to do it again. So you're always behind. You're never creating any new dollars. You're constantly staying behind the process. And so from that standpoint, if it is an investment, it's a lousy one because you never get a return on it. You keep your capital invested, and about the time that you get the return, i.e. higher tax dollars, it's time to replace it again. So that's why most city planners will tell you that the way that the city, a city does utilize or make money is to use an existing location and infill build. So you've got a downtown like we've got here in Stewart, and then there's a number of places, houses, old buildings, and whatever. So instead of tearing all of that stuff down, what makes sense from a building standpoint is to either add on to those buildings or to add additional infill building in the spaces that are open in the city, lots and blocks and places where there is building, or add additional density within the city by adding additional property within the same area, because the sewer system and the water system and the drainage and the utilities and all of the roads and curbing and all of that stuff presumably is already in place. And so therefore you don't have to. So now when the tax dollars go up because of that new building, and granted, you haven't improved all the other buildings per se, but you've added additional taxable property to the existing location, that generates additional revenue and ends up going in the city's pocket for them to use. Frankly, that's the whole concept behind community redevelopment areas, CRAs, is to take an existing location that already has a lot of the stuff that you need and agree to basically further develop it by encouraging other businesses to come in, providing some additional support within that community, and not necessarily going out and buying a brand and building a brand new community, but rather making improvements to some of the things that need to be improved to add density to that location or add businesses to that location, and make those changes so that ultimately you're putting in less dollars, and then you're going to increase the amount of return on that. And that generally is the way it works. And ultimately, that type of infill building makes sense. It's the same thing with a lot of the stuff that government does. What my point is that if a city went and borrowed money to do the new building, the new development, all of that, they go out and do that. By the time they generate enough tax revenue to pay that off, they basically are going to have to borrow money again to do the improvements. Under the CRA concept, what you try to do is provide selected improvements. There, it may make sense to borrow some money in the short run because you're not replacing everything, but just providing a resource that particular area needs that allows it to develop faster. For example, a parking garage or some sort of additional infrastructure, maybe some drainage, maybe in an area where the drain, or maybe you're bringing in internet services or cable or whatever. Maybe you're allowing that to happen. But again, the benefit there, or the advantage of that, is by letting private industry do that and them pay for it, and they recoup their investment, and not have the city borrow money to do that ultimately. But again, there are situations where it makes sense for a city to borrow money. I'm not saying that. For example, you don't want to pay for a sewer system or your waste treatment facilities. You not want to pay those out in cash, because by the time you got enough money from tax dollars to do something like that, everything would be polluted. You'd never get anything done. So there are some things that it does make sense. Primarily what makes sense is when you can do the project all at once and it's cheaper. So what we're talking about is saving money on the front end, not the investment, not that you're going out there and investing in different things, but rather that you're using that money when the costs are cheap. Like right now, the borrowing money is cheap. So if I've got a project on the horizon where I know I'm going to have to spend a lot of money, for me right now, saving that money up until you can get to that point, or charging people an assessment till you can get to the point to provide the service, right now you can probably borrow that money and get that service done cheaper, so you save money in the long run. that's a different story than creating a project and trying to generate an investment off of that type of thing, trying to generate something in the private sector, or trying to generate additional development in a separate location and do all that infrastructure. So anyway, it's just kind of it's an interesting thing because we talk about investment, and there really truly is no investment. There is debt, um, and but in the long run, most of the investment is not really truly investment. It's just spending in advance, um, and you're just going to have to continue to spend because the government doesn't generate income. It is strictly an entity that allows the transfer of income. So no matter what they do, the city takes money from one place, or the county, or whatever. I'm just happening to, because I'm sitting here in the city. They take money from one place, and they use it someplace else. They give it to somebody else. That's what they do. And there may be valid reasons why they do that. But the bottom line is that they don't create wealth. They don't create income. They shift it, and then they pick winners and losers. So they've picked, if they build a new development, and put in all this new stuff to bring in these bigger corporate businesses in. They have what they have done is shifted money from small businesses or property owners to, in effect, the big businesses that are going to take advantage of that infrastructure without having to pay the full cost for it. So, it's just it's a shifting process. So anyway, but one of the things that we were talking about last week was this whole concept of where we're going. And as I mentioned at the end of the show last week, I have concerns because I don't see a path out of where we're at right now. And again, I'll be very, I'm very upfront in terms of politically. I'm a very conservative, libertarian type person. I believe government needs to stay out of what we're doing. Let the market work. Let people work. In particular, don't pick winners and losers. Don't pick big businesses over small businesses. Don't pick big financial institutions over small financial institutions. Let the people make their decisions. And as much as possible, create a level playing field. As I've said many times before, not every market is a free market, so you can't treat it like it is. I hate it when people say, "Oh, this is a free market capitalistic system. We just need to let it go." Well, no. At some point, even a capitalistic free market system can become a monopoly, an oligopoly, and at that point, you have to regulate it because it has too much power. And at that point, you don't have a free market. That's not fair. That's not a fair market. And government's job is to regulate that. Its job is to regulate and make sure that doesn't happen. We have that already. We have sectors of our economy. Everybody knows. You can sit there and think about it. There are sectors of our economy where if you tried to think of more than 5 companies that provide those services, you would not be able to. You can't think of them. When there's only 5 or 4, you have a situation where that market needs to be regulated. So, for example, in the drug industry, how many major drug companies are out there? So you can't say, well, we're going to let drug prices go where they go. Yeah, I'll tell you where they go, right through the roof, because there's no way in the world there's anything to stop it. The consumer isn't going to have an effect on it because they don't have as much power. There's millions of consumers, hundreds of millions potentially, billions in some cases, and they're out there on one side of the equation, competing for a limited amount of supply. So at that point, the price is going to go up, and it's not going to be a fair price. And so that's why it's important that that be regulated. Now, if you can provide through the regulation a path to a free market, that can make some sense. In other words, if you can, in certain areas of a market, create competition, then you've got a chance that ultimately that'll switch over. For example, one of the things that, and again, to lay it all out, I am a supporter of what Trump tried to do. I'm not necessarily a big fan of him as a human being, but I didn't elect him as a human being. I elected him to implement policy that made sense for America, and I think he's done that. Um, but one of the things that he's done, I thought was pretty interesting, is that with the Affordable Care Act, many people want to, they want to have blinders and not think about it. But the fact of the matter is, the Affordable Care Act was already going away. It was financially going away because it didn't work out the way people thought. I think everybody thought that what would happen, let me put it this way, I think everybody but the big insurance companies thought that what would happen is that all of these people would be in there buying insurance, and everybody, if they were forced to buy, it would create this pool of resources so that the insurance companies would be out there, competing for those dollars, and it would force down price. In reality, what happened is that it created monopolies in certain areas, and at the best, oligopolies in other areas, where Blue Cross, for example, in Florida, is the only game in town. That's in some locations. If you don't have Blue Cross, you don't might as well not take coverage. So what's Blue Cross's incentive? They can charge whatever they want. So that's not going to force prices down unless the government says you can't charge that amount. Well, at that point, then the government has to provide it. And again, the government doesn't provide services. They take money away from some. So they take money away from Blue Cross and they provide it to themselves through administrative costs and then providing services. But all they're going to do is spike up the other costs, because again, at that point, there are only certain companies providing pharmaceuticals. The government isn't going to get in the business of creating pharmaceuticals, probably. But what the Trump administration did was to try to salvage the concept, because the concept was not bad. I don't think anybody had a problem with the concept of getting people to be able to have insurance and have coverage, particularly for catastrophic events and other things. I mean, we were spending way more than that through Medicaid previously. So there was a lot of sense to the fact of being able to provide a better insurance coverage if everybody was in the pool. Now, the problem is when you throw what you end up doing is throwing the sick in with the well, and making everybody cover the sick, and the well get upset about that because they're paying more for their health insurance than they should, and the sick have no incentive to get better because they got coverage now and it's free. So, or basically free. So, that created some disincentives to the program, and nobody really was paying attention to that. I mean, originally there was some concern about that because there was concern that everybody would go out and try to take health care right away, that they would, as soon as they were covered, all of these pre-existing conditions would be stuff that people would want to get taken care of. And that's true. And so in the original funding for the Affordable Care Act, there was more money provided in the early stages. There was a higher taxes and more money provided in the early stages to allow for that, so that there would be money to cover that, because they knew that that would be a cost that the insurance companies couldn't absorb. So that was built into the system. But what they didn't do, and then what they tried to do, was provide these, to provide some additional, they tried to provide to additional opportunities. They tried to provide these statewide exchanges, but those again were expensive to administer. You're talking about administering a major health plan, and most states aren't equipped to do that, regardless how big they were. And so the costs of implementing these plans at the state level became astronomical. And so even the states that were very liberal and wanted to provide extra benefits, and so they figured if they could control it, they could provide extra benefits at potentially lower cost, in effect ended up abandoning it or turning around and not being able to do what they wanted to do. And then they sued people. So it doesn't, you can't force it to work. It has to work because the market makes it work. And as soon as you start coming in and tweaking it, you can't control what's tweaked. I think I mentioned previous, I'll give you an example of that. And that's what makes it difficult sometimes is people sometimes think that they see all of the potential possibilities. And that's what makes the free market system better than, when you have one, than a government controlled system, because no matter how smart the scientists are, no matter how smart the government people are that are running these programs, they cannot see all of the potential possibilities or outcomes of an action. The people in mass can and do. In other words, that's the advantage of a true free market system, is that the market automatically moves to a fair price because the people in mass are buyers or sellers. And as long as there's equal numbers of strength of buyers and sellers on both sides of the market, you will have the market automatically adjust. It will automatically make whatever changes are necessary to get to an equilibrium price, which is considered to be a fair price. That's the price at which the seller is willing to sell and the buyer is willing to buy. In a free market system, that's the equilibrium price, and that's a fair price. That means that the seller got what they would want to get or expect to get. They would love to get more, but they got what they should have gotten for the product, and the buyer paid what they should have paid, right? But what happens in a controlled system, a government controlled system, is the government tries to estimate or tries to determine what should be that price, what the consumers would have done or did want or would do, or what the seller's willing to give up or isn't willing to give up, what the buyer is willing to do or isn't willing to do. And so they come up with a price, but that price is not going to be a fair price. It might be occasionally by accident, but in general is not going to be, because that price is going to constantly shift based on the market changes, and government isn't going to be able to see those shifts until after they've occurred. So for some period of time, no matter how good the government does, they're going to be in a situation where there's no equilibrium. And ultimately, they're never going to get to that point unless it gets to the point that the parties on the other side of the equation from the government are of equal strength. Interestingly enough, again, on the Affordable Care Act, one of the provisions of the Affordable Care Act that has still not gone into effect, that has still not been implemented, and there was a reason for that, people. There's a reason that we're this many years down the road. What are we, 12 years down the road or whatever, and this hasn't been implemented. The reason it wasn't implemented, it was the Cadillac insurance penalty. Now, many people don't realize it, but there was a provision in the Affordable Care Act that if you provided, as an employer, if you provided too good of insurance, you had to pay a penalty. In other words, the government determined what was adequate insurance. If you elected to provide a higher level of insurance than that as a benefit to your employees, you were penalized, you were taxed, right? Now, what happened is the government, when they originally put this thing in play, and Congress, when they originally voted it in, remember Nancy Pelosi's comment that we have to pass it to see what it is? Well, that really truly was what was going on there. And in this particular thing, what they did is they passed it, and they with this penalty on it, and then realized, thinking that that penalty was going to really just impact high-income individuals who were going to choose to have full coverage with no deductibles. And yes, there were people like that were going to choose that. But what they didn't realize is it significantly impacted unions, collective bargaining. They had bargained a higher level of insurance coverage as part of their collective bargaining agreement, and the employers had agreed to it. And now the employers were going to be forced to withdraw it because it would be a Cadillac program and they would have to pay a penalty. Or the union would have to, if the union wanted to continue with it, they were going to not get paid as much somewhere else because the company was going to have to pay this tax. When the administration and Congress at that point, but when administration found out that that was what was going to happen, and again, you think they'd know that, but they didn't. They didn't think about who also gets Cadillac insurance. So what they did is immediately postponed the implementation of in the correction. They postponed the implementation of that Cadillac tax. Why was that? Well, they figured if they got it far enough down the road, the market would have corrected it. There would have been enough money in there. The people's insurance costs would have gone down, and the unions wouldn't lose anything. Their costs would go down, and they'd still be getting the same coverage, but they'd be making the same kind of money because the businesses would have all gotten a break because those prices went down. But they were wrong. That didn't happen. I remember at the time of that, there were a lot of people that said, if this program is so bad, why are the insurance companies supporting it? Why is Aetna and Blue Cross? And well, I think many of you, if you probably know now, why did they support it? Well, because it wiped out all the small insurance companies. Think about it. Remember, there used to be a couple insurance companies that did nothing but provide health savings account insurance. That's what they did. That was their niche. That was their market. They're gone. There were certain entities that provided trade association insurance. There were ones that provided high deductible insurance, catastrophic insurance, a significant amount of that wasn't covered. All of those, things like Aflac, for example, where it was designed to cover certain things. They had to adjust because now a lot of pre-existing conditions are covered. A lot of basic things that normally weren't covered were covered. So, and it took away your ability to have some of this stuff. And so a lot of different insurance companies, the small ones, all went away. So there was no competitions. And that's what Blue Cross and that's what Aetna and the big insurance company, that's what they knew. They knew that if they just played along with the government and maybe, suffered a little bit, which they did, they would eventually gain control of the market and be able to charge what they wanted to charge. What they didn't realize is that the thing would be so catastrophic and so expensive that even they wouldn't be able to provide the coverage. And so they might be the only market in town, but they wouldn't be able to do it for what the government had promised that it would cost or is willing to pay. And if the government isn't willing to pay, they're bigger than the insurance company. The insurance company has to either say, I'm not going to do it, I'm going to get out of the market, or I'm going to lose money. And they couldn't afford to lose money because, all of their shareholders will leave. So it actually was worse than the insurance companies thought. They thought they would ride out a period of time. Because they were big enough that they had some economies of scale, they would capture large portions of the market and then make profits as a monopoly or an oligopoly. They would lock in profits. What they failed to realize is that the other side of the coin that would never give them a significant profit, never give them an unfair profit from their standpoint, was the government. And the government is more powerful and bigger than they are. Just like the government is bigger and more powerful than the pharmaceutical companies. So that's why even the insurance companies, the big ones, started saying, we're not providing that. We're not going to cover that. That's where all of these plans went away. We don't care if you want that. We're not going to do it. We don't care if you want that provider. We're not going to deal with that provider. If, we're going to deal with it. We found 5 people who are willing to offer medical services at this price that you're paying us. Those are the only 5 you can choose from. We don't care that your doctor is better than those 5. We don't care about that. You can't go to that doctor. You got to go to this doctor who's willing to pay the price. That's what's happened. That's what happened to the market. It was falling apart. Doctors weren't covered. Look this year at some of the stuff, even on bargained plans like through the school district and stuff. How many times that you don't have coverage for something with a particular doctor because they will not accept, they're not accepting the plan. So you lose your doctor at that point where you used to have the option of having that doctor. So that's what's happened to the market. That's the health insurance market is a good example of that. But it can be, like I said, the Trump administration originally was then instead of allowing the states to protect and keep out insurance companies, which is how the law was written before, Trump started to create the regional insurance companies. And so instead of regional insurance markets, so that if you were in the southeast region of the United States, you could sell insurance into Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, North and South Carolina, whatever. You would be able to tackle those markets. And that's kind of, and that would then provide some additional alternatives and competition, even if it was interestingly enough, even if it was another Blue Cross. For example, when that opened up, and it also opened up to trade associations, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan actually was coming into Florida to offer insurance to trade associations in competition with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Florida, because Blue Cross Blue Shield of Florida didn't have to do that, and they didn't want to do it. But Michigan said, yeah, we'll do that. We've been doing trade association type stuff forever, so we'll do it. And so that's what happened. So that's what I'm saying. That was kind of smart, because even though it was obviously a market that had to be regulated, it was not you can create pockets of competition, which then can produce better products and better, better services. So anyway, but getting back to what I was talking about is that my concern at this point is that the government has backed itself into a corner. We've borrowed a ton of money. No matter what we've called it, it's really been spent. It's been spent on stuff. Some of it's been spent on stuff that might last more than a year, but a large portion of it has been spent on stuff that is gone. It's wages, money that's been spent a long time ago. That money has been provided to the employees, has been provided then to the consumers, and it's gone. So now we're in a situation where, we've gotten tremendously into debt, and at some point, that debt, currently it's true, that debt is forcing other loans out, and the reason is that is a couple things. One, the banks and the financial institutions made enough money off of the PPP loans and some of the activity there that they don't need to make another loan. They do. I mean, they're in the business of making loans. But what I'm getting at is they don't have to take a lot of risk right now because they've already making their numbers. So from a practical standpoint, there's no incentive for them to loan to certain markets or to certain people because they don't need to take the risk. They view the risk as greater than the potential reward because they're already having a good year. Now, a year from now, 2 years from now, that might be a different story. But right now, they've already made a lot of money. So what's happened is because the government has basically borrowed a lot of money and pushed it through the system, it's created a situation where the banks don't need to borrow a lot of money to push through the system. They don't need to go out and pay depositors higher rates. They don't need to do all that because they don't need the cash flow. They've made the money. They're already liquid. They've gotten their cash back that they lent out. So, they've already done a pretty good job this year financially, and their investors are going to be really happy, and they don't need to take any further risk. So we're already seeing small business squeezed out of the market, not by interest rate, but by credit rate, credit risk, because the banks are not willing to take that. And that's what's happening. The big banks deal in a different market. They can take whatever deposits they get from our local market, and they can move it up into Canada. They can move it over into, New York. They can move it into wherever they want to move it, to Spain, to Greece, wherever they want to loan money. They can loan it. They have access worldwide to spend your money, to invest your deposits. So they don't have to put it back into small business, which is what needs to happen, because this recovery won't happen unless there's liquidity in the small business community. And there is no liquidity in the small business community right now. It's, even if you're making decent money, there still is not a lot of liquidity, because a lot of businesses either have loans that they have to pay back, or are sitting there not knowing what they can do with their cash, and are reluctant to invest their cash long term, because they're not sure what's going to happen and when they're going to need it. And that uncertainty has been exacerbated by the election. And that's, a lot of people right now are sitting on cash, or are sitting on investments that they're not liquidating, because they're not sure what's going to happen. They don't know where to go. That's true in the stock market. That's true in the real estate market. That's true a lot of places. There's a lot of uncertainty in the market. And when there's that much uncertainty, there's a tremendous amount of risk in the market right now, because we really don't know what's going to happen and where it's going to go. And as I said, the concern is that a free enterprise system only goes one of two ways. It goes a depression, a major depression, which resets the market and actually causes the capitalist system to survive, creates a lot of pain and a lot of injury. It's not pleasant. It's not good. You don't want to really get there. But when you've gotten there, the only way to come out of it in a free enterprise system is through that. Now, the alternative is a non-free enterprise system, a socialist system, or a government-controlled system, communism, socialism, whatever. And keep in mind, that is what we're talking about. We're talking about who controls the economy. We're not, you can put whatever label you want on it, but if you have a system where the government is providing the funds to businesses and not providing funds to other businesses, that is a socialistic system. Socialism is the control of income. Communism is the control of income and assets. So in a communistic system, you're not allowed to own assets. You don't own land. You don't own buildings. You own rights given to you by the government to put something on that land, or own that building, or use that building, but you don't own it. It's ultimately owned by the state. It's owned by the government. On the other hand, a socialistic system doesn't own the property. You're right. You have a right to own property, but the government tells you what you can do with it. In other words, by taxing it away, or by taking your income. If you do what they don't want you to do, or they think somebody else should have more income than you, they take your income away. Well, I can tell you from an accounting standpoint, if you have an asset that you're not allowed to keep the income, that's not really your asset anymore. That asset has no value. So when fully implemented, a socialistic system and a communist system are exactly the same, because the assets, although not owned by the government in a socialistic system, the value is zero, because the socialistic system controls the income off those assets. That's an interesting thing and frankly, those are accounting principles. The definition of the value, when we have to look at an asset, a building, let's say, from an accounting standpoint, to determine whether or not that building has been the value of that building has been impaired, and we need to write it down to cost, or to below cost, because right now it's a cost. And if it's worth less than cost and is expected to stay there, we have to evaluate whether or not to write that down, so that you can't have it on your books at $1 million. You have it on your books at $200,000. So we have to make that determination. Well, it's usually pretty easy, because very seldom is there an asset that has permanently declined in value. But the way you do it is you look at the income stream, the expected income stream from that asset, what kind of income it's going to generate over the next 20 or 30 years, its economic life, and you discount that to the present. And if that number is greater than the cost that you've got it on the books, then you leave it alone, particularly. And then if it's a temporary, you still leave it alone. So very seldom do we write it down. But so now let's take it to the government side, the communist side. Let's say you have a socialist system where I can take all of the income from that asset and I'm going to redirect it over to someplace else in the economy because I have the right to it first. It's 100% tax basically. So I'm taking all the money first and then redistributing it. Well, then I'm not going to make any money off that asset. And it's permanent because as long as the government is in place and as long as that socialistic system is in place, I will never make any money off that asset. So therefore, that asset is worth zero. So now what's the difference between an asset that I don't own, that the government owns, and an asset that I do own, but it's worth zero? Nothing, right? So that's why I say socialism, communism, same thing. It's just important to understand that. Now, what I was talking about is from a debt standpoint, on a socialistic system, if you look at it, they always have to borrow money because the economy continues to go down. Governments don't produce anything. They redistribute. They never get it right as to who's going to be the next big winner. Look what happened when our U.S. government tried to pick winners in the solar area, right? We didn't get it right. That's because individuals can't be smarter than the market. They just can't, and they will never get it right completely. So what happens is you have an inefficient use of resources, and that inefficient use of resources causes inequities in prices, inequities in values, and it causes debt to get higher and higher because it can't be paid back. The only way a socialistic country can get out of that is hyperinflation. If I inflate my assets, I inflate interest rates, I inflate my currency. At some point now, I've got something that's not worth anything. It's interesting that I think that in Venezuela, they've currently devalued their currency to the point that it takes $1 million to make up it takes up $1 million of their currency to make up $1. Is how bad their situation is. And it just keeps getting worse and worse. So anyway, that's kind of where we're at with what I'm worried about. And I think that's where we're looking at down the road is a potential for this hyperinflation. We're going to talk about it a little bit more, see what you can do and what you should do as a result of that if that happens. So anyway, join us again next week right here on WSTU Digital 1450, Martin County's Heritage Station.